Nuclear powers India and Pakistan are on the brink of all-out war as India strikes targets inside of Pakistan. Just how did we get to this point? And more importantly, is there still an off-ramp to avoid a nuclear catastrophe? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so the overall story, if you've been living under a rock, is that India has struck Pakistan with a series of missile and fighter jet strikes in response to a terror attack perpetrated by militants that India claims Pakistan has been explicitly backing. This is taking place in the contested Kashmir region. And what's so troubling is, again, both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers that essentially have constructed their nuclear arsenals solely as a deterrent force against each other. So these are countries that have been absolutely at each other's throats, literally for probably about 60 years, 80 years or so. And this is just the latest in a multi-decade fight over the Kashmir region that has never really resolved in any kind of meaningful way. Right now, what was a sort of low-level tit-for-tat sort of governance and insurgency really escalated last month when a number of Indian tourists were killed by a Pakistan-backed militant group. And this led to a series of artillery fire exchanges along Kashmir's line of control between the two sides, which resulted in even more death. And now this has escalated a third time to a strike by India on Pakistan targets. Now, India's official stance is that these strikes were deliberately avoided targeting Pakistani army sites. They said this is about deterring and retribution on the terror group that perpetrated these. And this, I think, is we're going to talk about whether or not this is a potential on-ramp or if escalation is coming. But before we get into that, one of the things that I did want to mention is that if you are like me, and I see in the demographics, I know you guys are like me, right? You are dudes, you're likely to be married, have kids, you've got busy lives. We've all got busy lives, right? I make content 7 days a week. I run a business and I'm still trying to get after it in the gym, right? I just actually this weekend completed a 50-mile race, a triathlon, which is a lot of time on the bike. But the secret weapon that I had is Strike Gum, right? This is built for people like you and I, people that are too busy to, mix up some fancy pre-workout with some crazy name, right? We're not 20 years old anymore, right? We need energy that goes where we do. And that's what Strike Gum does best, with 90 milligrams caffeine in every single piece, right? You can pop it in your gym bag, your glove box. I can literally put it in my pocket when I'm mid-ride or mid-run, chew a piece, get that energy surge to lock in, focus, and finish it out and get back to the rest of my day, being a dad, being a business owner, being there for the people that need me the most. So if that is you, go to strikegum.com, pick some up. And remember, guys, I see in the data, 50% of people that chew a single piece of Strike Gum order again and again. So if you are one of those people, don't rip yourselves off. Get to subscribe and save. You can cancel anytime. Literally, it's 20% off. It reduces the cost per piece of gum to literally less than $1, right? So you're getting an energy drink's worth of caffeine, no sugar, and instead of spending $5 or $6 on that Red Bull, that Amp Energy, you spend like 75 cents on a piece of Strike Gum. It's a no-brainer. So check it out. Link is in the description, strikegum.com, or on Amazon. Okay, so here's the thing. So India strikes a number of targets in Pakistan. Pakistan, in turn, has said, we are giving our armed forces, quote, freedom of action to retaliate. Now, what will probably happen, what I suspect, well, let's talk about the best case scenario, right? The best case scenario is that both sides sort of agree that this is the high watermark, right? This is sort of what we saw with Iran and Israel, where the Iranians struck Israeli targets, the Israelis struck back, and then both sides kind of said, okay, we did our part. We have shown that we are not taking these actions lying down. Neither side has suffered catastrophic, unacceptable levels of damage. And so this conflict is off-ramped. This is, I think, what cooler heads are hoping happens in this instance, in which India demonstrates a forceful response that it can sell to its public by saying, listen, we had our fighter jets, our Air Force strike targets in Pakistan, but it's not an unacceptable level of loss because the Pakistani military was not targeted. These were terror groups. And part of the reason that states like Pakistan will sponsor these terror groups is for exactly these kind of reasons. The same reason the Iranians like to associate with the Houthis or back Hezbollah or even Hamas. It's because they it creates an air gap between the state and the actions of these terror groups. And so that enables them to sit there and go, when they go a bit too far, as we've seen here, the militaries, the official states get to back away and say, whoa. These are terror groups. They are not state employees. These are not uniformed members of our military. They are a rogue element, and we cannot protect them. It gives the state deniability, right? And the ability to have a straw man of sorts for, in this case, India to attack and destroy, right? And so the hope is that by striking just these targets, Pakistan has provided an off-ramp. Now, chances are, I think the odds are better than even that you're going to see some kind of retaliatory strike by the Pakistanis. But the question that we really need to ask ourselves is, what is it going to be, right? Now, the troubling part is you can see that there seems to be some level of increase in shelling. This is from about an hour and a half ago. And more interesting is that you see India is actually conducting nationwide civil defense drills, again, sort of preparing their public for the event that Pakistan engages, maybe not even in nuclear strikes, but in air attacks against sites sort of near the border in the Kashmir region. All of this, as a sign, though, is what is the likelihood of this escalating to a nuclear conflict? I actually believe that it remains pretty low. And the reason I think that is because the region that this is under is solely and exclusively the region of Kashmir. And Kashmir, let's see if we can find it here. So right here is Kashmir. You can see it's in the northernmost part of India, with India administering about 60, I think about 50% of the region is administered by India, but this region contains about 70% of the region's population. Then you have Pakistani Kashmir, which has about 30% of the population. And then you have the Chinese part of Kashmir, which is technically also contested. But this part of Kashmir is actually contains almost no residents. It's largely unpopulated. And so, of course, you can see there's another disputed territory in the western part of the country, the Andhra Pradesh region, which is more populated and more contested between India and China. So the thing to understand here is that this is not seen as existential. And strategic nuclear weapons, a strategic nuclear arsenal, exists to protect the existence of a country, right? Now, if Pakistan was to try to strike India's capital cities or major Indian urban centers, that might be a different story, right? When it's a threat to the existence of India as a state, that would justify, under most countries' nuclear doctrine, launching of their strategic nuclear arsenal, right? It's the idea. It's mutually assured destruction. However, a contested region like Kashmir, and it's worth noting that throughout Kashmir's history, or at least since about 1945, when the region initially became contested, you had it's been extremely restive with all sorts of offshoots of militant groups, separatist movements, police forces, security forces engaging in some pretty brutal crackdowns and human rights violations. It is just not a super desirable place to be. And I think ultimately, if you are the Indian government, you are not going to YOLO your entire country over a region that in some ways you feel sort of stuck governing, right? Again, it would be, trying to think of a good example. It would be, imagine the U.S. saying, listen, we're going to launch our nuclear weapons at Russia, the whole arsenal. We're going to drop the whole thing because the Russians invaded and took American Samoa, right? We'd say, okay, listen, yeah, you can't, it's American territory. You seized it, you can't. But that doesn't mean, and technically, right, the U.S. nuclear arsenal exists to protect the sovereignty of the United States. But maybe we should try to get American Samoa back with some different tools, right? And so that's, I think, the calculus that India and Pakistan are likely going to make here, that this region is already kind of problematic. Again, American Samoa doesn't have like an insurgency that's trying to separate, right? It's not a perfect analog, but the idea is that it is territory that is seen as pretty low stakes among cooler heads. But that doesn't mean that this can't rise in intensity as a conflict. And one of the other things that I want to point out that I think is really relevant is that there is, because the president of the United States has floated this notion that has not been seen as acceptable in the global world order since 1945, he's floated this idea that says if you invade someone's territory and you take and hold that territory for a long time, the international community may just accept it. If you can hold the territory for a decade, like Russia annexing Crimea and holding it for a decade, right? The international community obviously is not rolling tanks into Crimea to kick the Russians out, but they have not recognized that claim. The whole international community basically agrees that Crimea was illegally annexed, and it doesn't matter how long Russia occupies it, it's never going to be officially recognized. And the reason that happens is because they need to maintain this broad international norm that says even if your military can seize territory from your neighbors, it is never going to be recognized as being a legitimate way to expand your borders, which is distinct from basically the rest of human history, where if you were a big, strong empire, you had more men with shields and swords, you went into your neighbor's territory and you kicked them out and you conquered them and you expanded your empire. And so the fear is that because President Trump has came in and said, listen, the United States, we're willing to recognize that Crimea we just might let it be part of Russia, right? It's not a big deal. We'll just let them have it. But once you normalize that, the idea of if you can take it and hold it, it becomes yours, can spread across all different contested territories in the globe. And the fear is that that's happening right now in Kashmir, is that both Pakistan and India may look and say, guys, this represents our best opportunity. The world's largest superpower, the United States, has said, hey, if you hold it, we'll recognize it. And they've said, this may be our best window to take all of Kashmir, to resolve this issue in our favor once and for all, right? And the fear is that this idea of if you keep what you kill might spread to dozens of different contested territories across the globe. That is so the best case scenario is that we do tit, we do tat, the strikes happen, both sides agree that they've exacted their retribution, and then they move on. The worst case scenario, I think realistically, is that this becomes a persistent Kashmir conflict where both sides calculate that they can annex all of Kashmir and resolve the conflict in their favor. The result, of course, a massive influx of conventional troops and conventional military operations in the region, creating just kind of an unstable bloodbath and forcing two countries who the U.S. has complicated relationships with to sort of into conflict and force the U.S. to sort of choose one side over another, which is itself pretty problematic. Again, worth noting, remember, India is a really important partner for ensuring U.S. sanctions of Russia. Russia sells a lot of goods and services, but really a lot of raw materials to India, who needs it for their kind of industrialization push. And so India has been sort of willing to buy Russian oil in a way that the U.S. doesn't particularly love, but they've been repeatedly trying to get India kind of on board to these tougher sanctions regimes. But India says, listen, we have to continue to grow because we are also see ourselves as a counterbalance against China, right? India says, listen, we're a billion people. We're one of the world's largest economies and we're growing very rapidly. We have India on this side of us and China on this other side of us. And we have to make sure that we can fight them, not just with nuclear weapons and a large army, but a powerful economy and a powerful industrial base. And so when Russia offers them cheap fertilizer, cheap nickel, cheap steel, cheap oil and natural gas, India says, yeah, I think I'll take you up on this. U.S. doesn't like that. But remember, for 20 years during the war on terror, when the U.S. was in Afghanistan, it used Pakistan as it conducted drone strikes on Pakistani territory with the acquiescence of the Pakistani government. Occasionally, the Pakistani government actually would launch operations into the border regions to root out the Taliban. So you have a 20-year-long relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan, right? And you have this complicated relationship between the U.S. and India, which, again, India is also an American ally who is helping to counterbalance China. So the last thing the U.S. wants is to have these two sort of important, I wouldn't call them friends, I would call them non-adversaries, right? At war with each other. Because it's going to force the U.S. They're going to say, listen, U.S., you have to choose one of us. And that's not a choice the U.S. wants to have to make. So again, the potential disasters, the potential worst case scenario is pretty bad. Potential best case scenario, well, we should know in the next couple of weeks what's going to happen. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to Martin Baum, Chris Rossi, Stuart Abel, Daniel Brown, Sergey Zinchenko, Chris Holmes, Chris Gorchas, Daniel M., Ida Skycall, all of our lieutenant tier members. That is what I appreciate. You guys are great. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's video, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.